They targeted a small child. Earth answered with relentless wrath. Part 2. The Weight of a Name. There is a kind of anger that is loud. It breaks things. It shouts. It burns fast and leaves ash and regret behind it. Most civilizations across the galaxy had seen this kind of anger before. They understood it. It was manageable. You waited for it to run out of fuel, and then you sat down at a table and offered terms, and the shouting species, exhausted and hollow, usually took whatever was given to them. Then there was the other kind. The kind that went very quiet. The kind that made a decision and then got to work and did not waste a single breath on noise because every breath was needed for the task at hand. Earth was the second kind. President Laura Gaines had been awake for 31 hours when she walked into the emergency joint session. She was a short woman with gray at her temples and a way of looking at people that made them feel she was reading the back of their thoughts. She sat down, called the session to order, and did not make a speech. She said what needed to be said in 4 sentences. The Varek Dominion had killed a child of Earth on a station that was under the protection of the Earth Defense Force. It was an act of war. Earth would respond to it as an act of war. All those in favor say yes. Every hand in the chamber went up. Nobody said no. Nobody asked for a delay or a review or a committee to assess the situation. The vote took less than a minute. The session lasted 22 minutes in total, and most of that time was spent on the formal paperwork that would put the military on a full war footing. When General Nathan Cole walked out of the chamber and stood in front of the press, the first thing people noticed was his face. He looked like a man who had already finished being angry and had moved on to something harder and colder and far more dangerous. He stood at the podium without notes and spoke in a voice so steady it almost sounded bored. And that steadiness was the most frightening thing many people had ever heard from a person in uniform. He told the press that Earth would not negotiate. He told them there would be no request for reparations. He told them there would be no letter to the Galactic Council asking the Varek to please reconsider. He said Earth was going to find every ship involved in the strike on Kepler Station 7. Every officer who gave the order, approved the order, or carried it out. And when they were found, the galaxy would be given a very clear lesson in what happens when someone puts a weapon on a child of Earth. He answered no questions. He stepped away from the podium and went back to work. The Galactic Council watched the broadcast. Several ambassadors exchanged notes. The general consensus was that the humans were being emotional, which was expected from a young species, and that the emotion would settle within a week or two. The Varek ambassador called it disproportionate hysteria in a private message to his home command. He recommended the Dominion wait the humans out. Nobody consulted a history book. Nobody looked into what humans had done when their backs were against a wall. Nobody asked what species had produced soldiers who stormed beaches into walls of fire, who flew planes into enemy fleets with no way out, who crossed frozen mountains with bare feet to fight for something they believed in. Nobody asked what it meant when a species like that stopped making noise and started making plans. Owen Carver re-enlisted in the Earth Defense Force at 7 in the morning, 2 days after the strike. The enlistment officer behind the desk recognized his name and did not say anything unnecessary. She processed his file quickly and shook his hand when it was done. He nodded and left. He was not alone. By the end of the week, enlistment centers across Earth and every colony station were reporting numbers that had not been seen since the early expansion wars. The lines stretched out of buildings and down streets. Young people, old veterans pulling their reserve files out of storage, engineers, pilots, medics, soldiers, people who had never planned to serve in a military capacity in their lives, standing in lines with quiet faces and the same name in the back of their heads. The shipyards did not slow down. They sped up. The construction platforms above Earth, the dry docks on Mars, the assembly bays on Europa. All of them shifted from standard production schedules to war production. Managers stopped approving rest rotations. Engineers stopped going home at the end of their shifts. Welders worked by artificial light in the dark of space until their hands shook, then rested for a few hours and came back. Nobody had to be asked to stay. Nobody had to be given a speech about duty or sacrifice. They just worked. They worked with a name in their heads and a picture in their minds of a small shoe lying in the ash of a school shelter. Dana Carver, Lily's mother, went back to her nursing post at the station medical bay 9 days after the strike. Her colleagues tried to tell her it was too soon. She told them there were people who needed care, and she was capable of giving it, and she sat down and did her job. She moved through the ward with steady hands, and she helped every patient who needed help, and she did not break down once during her shift. When she came off duty that night, she found Owen waiting for her outside the bay. She looked at him for a long moment. "Come back," she said. "I will," he said. She held his face in both her hands for a few seconds. Then she let him go. Ambassador Kevin Marsh, who held Earth's seat at the Galactic Council, sat through 3 consecutive emergency sessions in which various alien representatives asked Earth to slow down, reconsider, allow time for mediation, and respect the Council's role as a peacekeeping body. Kevin Marsh was a thin man who wore his suits very neatly and had the kind of patience that came from having heard a great deal of noise over a long career. He listened to every speaker. He took notes. He did not interrupt. When it was his turn to speak, he said that Earth had heard everything the Council had said. He then said that he would like to remind the Council of how much they had said on the day a child was killed in a school shelter on Kepler Station 7. The room was very quiet. "Nothing," he said. "Not one word. So we will handle this ourselves, and we will let you know when we are done." Back on Luna Base, Colonel Aaron Holt had finished his list. It was very long now. He passed it to Fleet Command. Fleet Command looked at it, added several items, and sent it down the line to the people who would turn it into action. The fleet was being built. The crews were being trained. The plans were being drawn. And somewhere in every corner of the operation, in pockets and on walls, and above consoles, a small creased piece of paper was being passed around. A copy of a child's drawing of a rocket ship, with a crooked name written underneath it in a 7-year-old's handwriting. Nobody told people to carry it. They just did. The galaxy did not understand what was coming. It had seen wars before. It had seen revenge before. It had never seen a species turn grief into engineering and love into a weapon and aim all of it, every last piece, at the people who had made the mistake. 8 weeks after the strike on Kepler Station 7, the Earth fleet launched. They targeted a small child. Earth answered with relentless wrath. Part 3. The Hunt Across the Dark. Space is very large. Most species, when they think about war in space, think about it the way you think about a fist fight. 2 sides facing each other across a short distance, swinging until one side falls. The Varek Dominion fought that way. Heavy ships, slow movements, big weapons pointed forward, like a fist ready to punch. Their fleet was built to intimidate first and to fight second, because most of the time, by the time the fighting started, the enemy had already lost the will to go on. The Earth fleet did not move like a fist. It moved like a hand, spread out, quiet, reaching in multiple directions at once, feeling for the edges of things before closing in. Commander Grace Ellison stood on the bridge of the EDF carrier Kepler's Det and watched the star maps on the main display without speaking for a long time. She was a lean woman in her early 40s, with short dark hair and a habit of going very still when she was thinking hard. Her crew had learned to read her stillness. When she went that still, something was about to happen, and it was not going to be good for whoever she was thinking about. She had named her carrier herself when given the choice. The Fleet Designation Office had sent her a list of approved names. She had sent the list back and written 2 words at the top of the reply. Kepler's debt. Nobody had argued with her. Flanking her across the fleet's spread formation were Captain Ray Dunbar on the destroyer Lance Group, and Lieutenant Commander Pete Okafor leading the forward recon wing. Ray was a broad-shouldered man from Georgia who had spent 12 years flying patrols on the outer colony routes, and knew the empty spaces between systems better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. Pete was younger, quieter, with sharp eyes that missed almost nothing. The 2 of them had served together before, and they moved their ships with the kind of coordination that came not from orders, but from understanding, each knowing what the other was going to do half a second before it happened. The fleet ran dark. No active sensors broadcasting outward, no communication signals that could be tracked. They used only passive receivers and tight beam relays between ships, the signals so narrow and low-powered that picking them up at range would have been like hearing a whisper in a hurricane. They used the drift lanes, natural gravitational currents between star systems that required minimal engine burn to follow, so their heat signatures stayed small and cold and hard to separate from background radiation. From the outside, to any ship trying to scan the region, there was nothing there. Just space. Just dark. Inside Kepler's debt, the crew worked in low voices. People ate at their stations. They slept in short rotations and came back to their posts still rubbing their eyes. There was no music playing in the corridors, which was unusual for a long transit. Usually crews played something to fill the quiet. Nobody had suggested it this time, and nobody had missed it. On the 3rd day of the transit, Grace walked the lower decks of the ship. She did it not to inspect anything, but to be seen. Her crew needed to see her walking calmly, moving without urgency, as if everything was proceeding exactly the way she expected it to. She nodded to people. She asked a young gunner how his targeting calibrations were holding up. She stopped by the engineering bay and listened to the chief engineer, a stout woman named Val, explain a minor cooling adjustment she had made to the main drive. Grace listened to all of it and asked the right questions and then moved on. Near the end of her walk, she passed the forward bulkhead of Deck 3. Someone had taped a piece of paper to the wall beside the fire suppression panel. It was a printed copy of Lily Carver's drawing, the rocket ship with the small figure in the window, and the crooked name underneath. Grace stopped and looked at it for a moment. She did not touch it. She just looked. Then she went back to the bridge. The first contact came near the Venn cluster, 8 days into the transit. Pete Okafor's recon wing picked up the drive signatures of 3 Varric warships on long-range passive scan. The ships were repositioning after the Kepler station strike, moving to a new patrol lane in a slow, unhurried arc. They were not expecting company. Their active sensors were broadcasting openly, which told Grace they felt safe. They had no reason to feel otherwise. No species had ever followed a Varric strike fleet into the outer systems. Grace called her senior officers to the bridge. She laid out the contact positions on the holographic map. She told Ray and Pete what she wanted and how she wanted it done. The briefing lasted 8 minutes. No one asked her to repeat anything. "We are not here to blow them apart," she said at the end. "We need those ships intact, and we need people to talk to. Understood?" The fleet moved into position over the next 4 hours, drifting on minimal power, closing the distance like fingers closing slowly around something in the dark. The engagement, when it started, was sudden and complete. Ray Dunbar's Lance Group came in from the flank, firing disabling shots at the Varric engine sections before the enemy ships had finished raising shields. Pete's recon wing cut off the retreat lane. The Kepler's debt came in behind, locking targeting solutions on the Varric weapons platforms with a precision that shut them down in seconds. The whole thing was so coordinated and so fast that the Varric crew on the lead ship managed to fire exactly 2 return shots before their systems were cold and dark. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. The boarding teams moved in immediately after, suited up and armed, crossing the short distance between ships in sealed transports. Grace led the team that went to the Varric command vessel. She had asked to lead it personally. Nobody had suggested she stay on the carrier. They breached the airlock and moved through the Varric ship in 2 teams, clearing each section quickly and without unnecessary force. The Varric crew they encountered were either at their stations with hands raised, or had already moved to the designated surrender positions, which told Grace their captain had ordered compliance. That was useful. It meant the captain was calm enough to think. She found Admiral Greth Voss in the command chair at the center of the bridge. He was a tall being, gray-skinned with wide, flat eyes, wearing the heavy ceremonial rank markings of a senior Varric commander. When Grace and her team entered the bridge, he straightened in his chair and began reciting his rank, his credentials, his service record, and the terms under which he expected to be treated as a prisoner of high standing under galactic protocol. Grace let him finish. She waited until he was completely done. Then she reached into her jacket and pulled out a tablet. She held it out in front of him. On the screen was a school photo, a small girl with brown eyes and a missing front tooth, smiling at a camera somewhere on Kepler Station 7. Greth Voss looked at the image. He said nothing. "You are being detained," Grace said. "Earth will decide what happens to you." Her voice was very even. She nodded to her team, and they moved forward to secure the Admiral. The Galactic Council, monitoring events through relay feeds, immediately began drafting emergency statements. Multiple ambassadors called for Earth to stand down. They cited 12 interstellar conventions. They used words like illegal, destabilizing, and dangerous precedent. Ambassador Kevin Marsh listened to all of it from his council seat, with his hands folded on the desk in front of him. When it was his turn to respond, he did not raise his voice. "You said nothing when the school was hit," he said. "You are very loud now. That is something worth thinking about." He left the chamber before anyone could respond. On the bridge of Kepler's Det, Grace Ellison was already looking at the next set of coordinates on the star map. There were more ships out there. More names on the list that Aaron Holt had built in the long quiet hours on Luna Base. It was not close to done. It was only just beginning. They targeted a small child. Earth answered with relentless wrath. Part 4. No terms, no mercy, no forgetting. The Varric Dominion had not panicked in 400 years. They were not built for panic. They were built for control. Slow, heavy, deliberate control. The kind that came from always being the largest thing in the room. When Admiral Greth Voss failed to report in after the Venn cluster encounter, the Dominion's high command did not panic. They assessed. They looked at the data, ran their numbers, and decided what they were looking at was a skirmish, a probe, a young species throwing rocks to see what happened. They mobilized the home fleet as a precaution. It outnumbered the Earth force by almost 3-1. It was made up of heavy battle cruisers, each one larger than anything in the Earth fleet, built to hold a line and grind an enemy down through sheer mass and firepower. The Varric fleet commander, a senior officer named Dorath Ken, positioned his ships in a wide defensive arc between the home systems and the direction the Earth fleet was last tracked. He broadcast a formal warning, as required by Varric military tradition. The warning told the human fleet to stand down, return their captured vessels, release the detained officers, and withdraw from Varric space immediately, or face the full force of the Dominion's military response. He waited 20 minutes for a reply. No reply came. General Nathan Cole had not planned to reply. He had spent 5 weeks building a strategy in a room on Luna Base with maps and models and a team of officers who had been sleeping in 4-hour shifts because nobody wanted to leave the planning room for longer than necessary. The strategy did not involve lining up across from the Varric and trading fire like two ships passing each other on a river. That was what Dorath Ken was waiting for, because that was the only way the Varric had ever fought, and in that kind of fight, the biggest ship usually won. Cole had spent a long time thinking about how humans had won fights when they were not the biggest. The Earth fleet came from 4 directions. This was not a metaphor. Literally 4 directions. 4 separate formations that had been quietly positioning themselves over the previous 48 hours, using the same dark running techniques that had worked in the Ven cluster. The Varric fleet's sensors were pointed outward in a standard wide arc. They were not watching the asteroid field to their rear, because nothing had ever come out of an asteroid field in a way that made tactical sense. Nobody used asteroid fields as cover in a battle. The navigation was too dangerous at combat speeds. Human pilots, it turned out, had been practicing dangerous navigation since the first time someone decided to see how fast they could go down a mountain. Ray Dunbar's destroyer Lance Group came from inside the asteroid field, skipping through gaps in the rock in short microburst jumps, appearing on the Varric formation's flank for long enough to fire a volley, and then vanishing back into the field before targeting locks could be established. The first time it happened, the Varric gunners assumed it was a glitch in their systems. The second time, they started tracking. The third time, Ray was already on the other side. Pete Okafor's recon wing had spent the previous night seeding the main approach lanes with smart mines, each one coded to Varric drive signatures, so that Earth ships could pass through them freely. When Dorath Ken ordered 3 of his cruisers to push forward and engage, the mines activated. 2 cruisers lost engine function. The third managed to reverse out of the lane, but took hull damage in the process. Grace Ellison brought Kepler's Det and the main carrier group in from directly above the Varric formation, firing on command ships first, then weapons platforms, then communication relays. The targeting was precise, in a way that seemed almost strange. Every shot had a clear purpose, and the purpose was always to disable, not to destroy. Engine sections, weapons arrays, navigation systems. The Varric ships were being turned into very large, very expensive pieces of debris that could not move or fight, but the crews inside them were not being killed. The Varric had no framework for this. Their tactical library covered overwhelming force, surgical destruction, and punitive strikes. It did not cover an enemy that seemed to be carefully saving your life, while simultaneously taking everything away from you. Several Varric officers on separate ships reported in their after-action accounts that the most disturbing part of the battle was not the attacks. It was the pauses between attacks, the brief moments where Earth ships would hold fire, to allow a damaged Varric vessel time to broadcast a crew distress signal, or move a medical transport out of the line of fire. The battle lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, the Varric home fleet was broken. Not gone. Grace had not allowed annihilation, but the command structure was dismantled. The flagship was dark and drifting. 2/3 of the combat vessels were disabled, and the remaining ships had pulled back out of range, and were sitting still, in a way that meant they were waiting to be told what to do next, by someone who no longer existed. Dorath Ken, from his disabled flagship, sent a transmission to the Galactic Council. It was later recovered and translated. The message said only one thing. They fight like they have nothing to lose. Grace Ellison heard the message relayed to her bridge by her communications officer. She was looking at the star map. She was thinking about Owen Carver, standing outside the medical bay in a new uniform. She was thinking about Dana Carver, holding her husband's face in both hands. She was thinking about a drawing in someone's jacket pocket. They fight like they have everything to remember, she said. She said it quietly, not to anyone in particular. Her bridge crew heard it anyway. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then the last Varric warship in formation broadcast its surrender signal. A long, steady tone, that every species in the galaxy used to mean the same thing. Grace listened to it. She let it run to the end. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something that had no good word for it. A kind of deep, heavy exhaustion that sat in the chest and had nothing to do with being tired. It was the feeling of having done something that needed to be done, and knowing that doing it had cost something it could never give back. Around her, her crew sat at their stations in silence. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. A few people pressed their hands flat against their consoles, as if they needed to feel something solid. One officer near the rear of the bridge pressed 2 fingers to his lips for a moment, and then lowered his hand. The stars outside the viewport were the same stars they had always been. The comms officer turned from his station and told Grace that Fleet Command was asking for a status report. Grace straightened in her chair. She pulled her uniform flat. She looked at the star map one more time, at all the positions marked and cleared and finished. "Tell them," she said, "the Varric fleet has stood down. We are ready for the next phase." The next phase was not a battle. It was something harder. It was the part where Earth decided what it was going to do with what it had won, and what it was going to say to a galaxy that had watched the whole thing, and was now, for the first time in a very long time, paying very close attention. Somewhere, in the debris of the Varric home fleet, the flagship sat cold and dark and silent, and inside it, the long history of a civilization that had ruled through fear was sitting still and quiet too, waiting to find out if it was finished. They targeted a small child. Earth answered with relentless wrath. Part 5. What the Galaxy Learned. The Galactic Council Chamber was not a quiet place as a rule. It had been built for argument. The curved tiers of seats, each one assigned to a different species, had heard thousands of years of debate, protest, negotiation, and outrage. The acoustics were designed to carry voices clearly from any point in the room. Translators ran in real time. Every word said in that chamber was recorded, filed, and archived. But when the Earth delegation walked in on the morning of the formal proceedings, the chamber went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the acoustics. The other delegations watched General Nathan Cole and Ambassador Kevin Marsh cross the floor and take their seats. They watched the way the 2 men moved, not with arrogance, not with visible anger, just with a kind of settled, unhurried certainty that was somehow more uncomfortable than either of those things would have been. Several council members exchanged glances. A few shifted in their seats. They had expected demands. Most species, after winning a decisive military engagement, came to the council with lists. Territory, resources, tribute payments, formal apologies broadcast across multiple frequencies, reparations calculated down to the last unit of currency. These were the things you asked for when you had won a war. These were the things that told the galaxy how much you had been hurt and how much you needed to recover. General Cole placed a single document on the desk in front of him. Ambassador Marsh did not touch the microphone for a long time. He let the silence sit. He let the other delegations look at the document and wonder what was in it. Then he leaned forward and spoke. He said the document was called the Carver Accord. He did not explain the name. He said it the same way you say something that needs no explanation. The way you say a name that everyone in the room should already know. He read the 3 articles of the Accord aloud. His voice was measured and steady, and he did not pause between articles, or give the chamber time to interrupt. The first article stated that any deliberate strike on a civilian structure, a home, a school, a medical bay, a shelter, any building where non-combatants lived or were protected, would be classified as a crime against all recognized species in the Council, regardless of which species carried out the strike. Any signatory to the Accord would be obligated to respond collectively. The second article stated that children of any species, in any armed conflict, at any stage, were absolute non-combatants. Any action taken against them, any targeting, any strike, any deliberate harm, would be treated as an act of war against every species in the Council simultaneously, not just the species of the child. The third article stated that Earth would serve as the enforcement body for both articles. There was no term limit on this role. There was no requirement for Earth to seek Council approval before responding to a violation. Earth would act, and it would account for its actions after. The chamber erupted. It was not the quiet, careful protest of diplomats making strategic objections. It was loud. Several delegations were on their feet. The Varek ambassador, who had been brought in under very specific conditions that made him technically a guest rather than a full participant, sat very still in the back of his section and said nothing at all. The other ambassadors spoke over each other. The words excessive and unilateral and precedent filled the air in a dozen different languages. Kevin Marsh sat back in his chair and let them go. He let the noise run. He did not check his notes. He did not confer with General Cole. He waited with the patience of a man who had known this was going to happen and had already decided what he was going to do when it did. When the noise began to thin, he leaned forward again. He did not raise his voice. He said that on a day some weeks ago, a 7-year-old girl had been killed in a school shelter on Kepler Station 7. He said her name. He said it clearly and fully, not quickly, not as a detail in an argument. He said Lily Carver. He let the name exist in the chamber for a moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a small piece of paper. It was folded twice and slightly worn along the edges from being carried through the weeks of the campaign inside someone's uniform. He unfolded it and placed it flat on the surface of the display panel at his desk, and the image fed to the Council's central screen. A child's drawing of a rocket ship, a small figure in the window, a name written below in crooked letters. The chamber was very quiet again. "We are not asking for your permission," Kevin Marsh said. "We are informing you of how things are now. If you would like to discuss the specifics of the accord, we are ready to do that. But the accord is not optional, and Earth's role in it is not subject to a vote." The debate that followed lasted 3 days. It was thorough, detailed, and at times very heated. Earth's delegates responded to every point raised, answered every legal challenge, sat through every procedural objection. They were respectful. They were patient. They did not move. On the morning of the 4th day, the Carver Accord passed. Not unanimously. Several delegations voted against it or abstained, but enough voted in favor, including quietly and without public comment, 3 species who had themselves been targets of the Varek Dominion's method in previous generations, that the accord became binding council law. When the vote was announced, General Cole looked at the result on his tablet. He placed the tablet face down on the desk. He sat for a moment, still. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked with Kevin Marsh out of the chamber and into the long corridor outside. Neither of them said anything for a while. "She'd have been 8 next month," Nathan Cole said eventually. He was looking at the floor of the corridor. Kevin Marsh nodded. They walked out of the building into the open air of the Council's home station, and the light above them was the pale gold of an alien sun, and it was warm. Back on Kepler Station 7, a construction crew was finishing the last panels on the rebuilt shelter wall. Owen Carver was standing nearby, watching them work. He was not in uniform anymore. He had come home 3 days after the fleet returned, and Dana had been standing at the station airlock when his transport docked, and they had held each other for a long time without saying anything. He came to the school shelter most mornings. He did not know exactly why. He just found himself there, watching the station come back to life around the rebuilt wall, watching people walk past and look at it, and sometimes stop the way he stopped. Someone had painted a mural on the outer wall. Nobody knew who had done it. One morning it had simply been there. It showed a girl in a small white spacesuit, standing on the surface of a distant moon, with stars behind her, and her arms spread wide, as if she were about to run or fly, or both. She was looking up. Commander Grace Ellison stopped at the shelter on her way through the station during a layover between assignments. She had not planned to stop. She just did. She stood beside Owen Carver and looked at the mural, and neither of them spoke for a while, the way people do not speak in places that mean something to them. She wanted to fly, Owen said. Grace looked at the small figure on the moon, with her arms wide open. She will, Grace said. Every kid who gets to grow up safe out here, on every station in Colony, because of what we put into law. That's her flying. Every one of them. Owen looked at the mural for a long time. He did not say anything else, but something in the set of his shoulders changed slightly, as if something very heavy had shifted just a small degree. Across the galaxy, the Varick Dominion was rebuilding quietly, stripped of its fleet and its method, and most of what had made it feared. Intelligence reports noted that the Dominion had not attempted any pressure strikes in the weeks following the Accord. They had not made any territorial demands. They had not issued any ultimatums. They were, for the first time in 4 centuries, being very careful. In every Galactic Council threat assessment file, the entry for Earth had been updated. The analysts who maintained the files had argued for weeks about the right way to describe the human species. They could not agree on military strength because Earth's military was strong, but that was not the thing that had mattered. They could not agree on technology because Earth's technology was good, but also not the central thing. They went through many drafts. In the end, they wrote one sentence. It was added to the top of the file, above all the statistics and all the data and all the analysis. It said, "Do not touch their children." No analyst disputed it. No committee reviewed it. Everyone who read it once, and then moved on. And the sentence stayed where it was, because everyone knew it was the only thing that needed to be said. Outside the shelter wall on Kepler Station 7, the mural girl stood on her moon, with her arms wide, and the stars behind her. And the station moved around her in the ordinary rhythm of a place full of people living their lives. And the stars above the station were the same stars they had always been, cold and enormous and very far away. And they said nothing, because they did not need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. They targeted a small child. Earth answered with relentless wrath. Part 1. The mistake that started a war. The Varick Dominion had never lost a war. Not once in 400 years of expansion across the outer systems had any civilization stood up to them and survived the experience. They had broken stronger empires than Earth. They had shattered species that had been flying between stars for centuries before humans had even left their own atmosphere. The Varick did not fight with emotion. They did not fight with pride. They fought with method, and their method had never failed them. The method was simple. You picked something the enemy loved. You destroyed it. Then you waited for them to cry and beg and sign whatever paper you put in front of them. Admiral Brett Voss had used the method 14 times in his long career. 14 civilizations, 14 strikes, 14 surrenders. He was not a cruel being by the standards of his people. He was simply practical. The strike was never personal. It was pressure, the same way you pressed a thumb into soft ground to leave a mark. You pressed, and the ground gave way. That was all. When the human colony on Kepler Station 7 refused to hand over mining rights to the Dominion, Brett Voss reviewed the station maps with quiet efficiency. He selected a civilian hub near the center of the colony. It was the kind of place that would hurt the humans emotionally without destroying their productive infrastructure. He did not want to wreck the mining equipment. He wanted the humans to hand it over, crying, grateful to still be alive. His weapons officer asked if the structure had been cleared of civilians. WrathHFY said it did not matter. One strike, one message. The beam fired at 14:32 station time. At 14:32, the children of Kepler Station 7 were in the middle of an evacuation drill. Their teacher, a young woman named Kara Flynn, had been moving the kids from the main classroom toward the shelter corridor, when the alarm changed tone. She did not understand why the alarm sounded different until the wall behind her turned white with heat. She grabbed two children with her hands and ran. Others ran with her. Most of them made it. 3 did not. One of the 3 was a 7-year-old girl named Lily Carver. She had brown eyes and a missing front tooth, and a habit of drawing pictures of spaceships during quiet time. That morning, before the drill started, she had finished a drawing of a rocket with a small figure in the window. She had written her own name under the figure, in crooked letters. She had folded the paper and put it in her pocket because she wanted to show her father when he got home from his engineering shift. She never got to show him. The footage reached Earth at 14:43 station time, 11 minutes after the strike, carried by quantum relay across the light years between Kepler Station and the home planet. It arrived first on military channels, then on civilian news networks, then everywhere at once. Colonel Aaron Holt was in the operations center on Luna Base when the feed came through. He was holding a cup of coffee he had not yet drunk. He watched the footage without moving. Around him, 12 other people watched the same screens. Nobody said anything. The room was so quiet that the soft hum of the ventilation system seemed loud. The footage showed the burning wall. It showed Kara Flynn sitting on the floor of the corridor with 2 children in her arms, shaking. It showed station workers pulling rubble with their bare hands. It showed a small shoe lying in the ash near the entrance to the shelter. Aaron Holt set his coffee cup down on the console. He looked at it for a moment. Then he opened a secure line to Fleet Command on Earth and spoke in a voice that was very calm and very flat and frightening in the way that very calm, very flat voices can be frightening when they come from people who are not calm at all on the inside. "Pull everything," he said. "All of it." The officer on the other end of the line did not ask him to repeat himself. On Earth, the name Lily Carver began to spread before the military had even finished its first briefing. A journalist on a news channel said her name on air, and then had to stop speaking for a moment. A man in a coffee shop in Chicago watched the broadcast and put his head in his hands. A woman in Seoul stopped in the middle of a crosswalk and did not move until the people around her gently pulled her to the sidewalk. By the time the sun had moved across half the planet, people were standing outside in every major city. They were not rioting. They were not breaking things. They were standing in silence, faces turned up toward the sky, toward the stars somewhere above the clouds, as if they wanted to be sure the universe could see them looking back. Owen Carver, Lily's father, was brought the news by a station medic while he was still in his engineering suit. He sat down on a crate in the equipment bay and did not stand up for a long time. His wife Dana was already at the medical bay. He went to find her. They sat together in a small room and did not speak much. There was not much to say that the silence was not already saying. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, in the great curved hall of the Galactic Council, the alien ambassadors had already begun drafting their response documents. Several of them categorized the strike as a standard Varec pressure tactic. They opened files on human psychology, looking for information on how long it typically took a young species to move from emotional reaction to rational negotiation. Their estimates ranged from 48 to 72 hours. The Varec diplomatic envoy issued a brief statement. It described the strike as a measured response to colonial noncompliance. It used the word proportionate twice. A reporter found Owen Carver the following morning outside the medical bay. She showed him the Varec statement on her tablet. He took it. He read it slowly, all the way through. He folded the tablet back and handed it to her. "Tell them we're coming," he said. He said it the same way a man says something he has already decided before he opened his mouth. There was no heat in his voice. There was no shaking. He just said it. The way you state something that is simply true. The way you say the ground is hard, or the dark is cold. Then he went back inside to sit with his wife. On Luna Base, Colonel Aaron Holt had not slept. He was still at his console, building a list. The list had names on it. The names were of ships, officers, supply routes, station positions, response windows. The list was getting longer. He worked quietly through the night, and the stars outside the reinforced window did not move, and somewhere between the stars, the Varec Dominion sat in the silence of what they had done, not yet understanding that the silence was not grief.